Let me tell you about the night I almost froze to death because one woman decided that HOA rules were more important than a blizzard, and then had the absolute nerve to knock on my door asking to warm up inside my house. Yeah, that actually happened. My name is Doug Turner. I've lived in the Maplewood Estates community for going on 7 years now. It's a nice enough neighborhood, I'll be honest. Good neighbors, decent streets, everyone keeps their yards looking respectable. I bought my house out here because it was affordable, had enough space for me to set up a proper workshop in the garage, and the neighbors on my side of the street are genuinely good people. My buddy Carl lives 3 houses down. There's an older couple, the Hendersons, right next door who always bring me pie during the holidays. Good folks all around. But then there's the HOA. Now, I've had run-ins with the HOA before. Nothing crazy. Once they sent me a warning letter because my mailbox post had chipped paint. Another time they fined me because I had a basketball hoop at the end of my driveway, and apparently it needed to be stored out of sight when not in use. Minor stuff that annoyed me but wasn't worth fighting over. I paid the fine, moved the hoop, touched up the mailbox. Life went on. But this past January, the HOA crossed a line so spectacular that even I, a pretty patient guy, absolutely lost my mind. And the person at the center of all of it was a woman named Debra Crane. Debra had been on the HOA board for about 3 years at that point. She'd started as a regular member, then gotten herself elected as Community Standards Chair, which as far as I could tell was a position she'd basically invented so she could have extra authority to write violation notices. She was in her mid-50s, drove a pearl white SUV that she parked precisely in the center of her driveway every single day, and she treated the HOA rulebook the way some people treat the Bible, except she was way more flexible with her own interpretation of it when it suited her. I'd had issues with Debra specifically. She'd written half my violation notices herself. She once knocked on my door to tell me that my garbage bins were 3 inches too close to the street on a Tuesday, and collection wasn't until Wednesday, so I was in violation. 3 inches. She measured it. She had an actual tape measure in her hand. That's who we're dealing with here. Now let me set the scene for you properly, because the weather plays a massive role in everything that happened. January in our part of the state is brutal. We're in a region that gets real winter, not that decorative winter where you get an inch of snow and everyone posts it on Instagram. I'm talking about the kind of winter where the temperature drops to single digits, the wind cuts right through you, pipes freeze if you're not careful, and the roads turn into ice rinks between plowing sessions. It's the kind of winter that tests your preparation and your patience simultaneously. My house runs on propane. I have a propane furnace and a propane water heater, which is pretty standard in our neighborhood since the development was built before the gas lines were extended to this part of town. Almost every house on my street has a propane tank somewhere on the property. Mine is a standard 500-gallon tank that sits on a concrete pad behind my house, partially hidden by a lattice fence that, yes, I installed specifically because the HOA had rules about tank visibility from the street. I played by those rules. I always played by the rules, even the dumb ones. I have my propane delivered by a company called Ridgeline Propane. Been with them for 5 years. Their drivers know my property, know the access route, and I'd never had a single issue with the delivery process before. You call them when you're getting low, they come out and fill you up. Simple as that. The week before the big storm, I checked my tank gauge and noticed I was sitting around 30%. The weather forecast was already looking grim. They were calling for a significant winter storm system to come through that Friday, possibly dropping 18 to 24 inches over about 36 hours, with temperatures expected to fall to around -8 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Wind chills would push it well below -20. This wasn't a maybe big storm situation. This was a definitely serious dangerous storm situation, and every news outlet in the area was hammering that point home. I called Ridgeline on Monday to schedule a fill-up before the storm hit. They were swamped with calls, obviously, because every other person with a propane tank in the region had the same idea, but they got me on the calendar for Thursday afternoon. Perfect. That gave me a day of buffer before the storm was supposed to arrive Friday morning. Thursday came. It was already cold, maybe 12 degrees out, and the sky had that flat gray look that meant serious weather was coming. I was working from home that day, keeping an eye on my window, waiting for the Ridgeline truck to pull up. Around 2 in the afternoon, I saw it rolling down the street, that big orange and white truck, and I felt the relief you feel when a supply delivery shows up before a crisis rather than during one. That's when Debra Crane happened. I watched from my window as the truck pulled up and the driver, a guy named Phil who I recognized from previous deliveries, started to slow down to turn into my driveway access. Ridgeline's trucks need to come around the side of the house to reach the tank, and there's a shared access lane that runs along the side of my property. It's on my property. My land, my access lane, fully within my property lines. I've had this verified twice. But the entry point for the lane does come off the main neighborhood road, so the truck had to position itself on the street for a moment to line up the turn. And that's exactly when Debra Crane pulled her pearl-white SUV out of her driveway, which is 3 houses down from mine, and parked it diagonally across the road, blocking the truck's path completely. I could not believe what I was seeing. I literally put my coffee cup down and pressed my face against the window like a golden retriever who spotted something confusing in the yard. Phil hit his brakes. I could see him lean forward in the cab, probably trying to figure out what on earth this woman was doing. I was already grabbing my coat and heading for the front door. By the time I got outside, Debra was standing in front of her SUV with her arms crossed, wearing a puffy down coat and a look on her face like she'd just won something. She had a clipboard. Of course she had a clipboard. "Mrs. Crane," I said, coming down my front walk, "what are you doing?" She turned to me with that tight little smile she got when she believed she was about to inform you of something you should already know. Doug, large commercial vehicles are not permitted to park on neighborhood streets or use the service lanes during non-designated hours. It's in the Community Covenants, Section 7, Paragraph 4. Phil had climbed down from the cab by this point and was standing there in his orange work jacket looking confused. "Sir, I have a scheduled delivery here." This access is to a residential propane tank. We do this regularly, not without prior written notification to the HOA board, submitted a minimum of 48 hours in advance, Debra said, cutting him off without even looking at him. She was still looking at me. I stared at her. "Debra, I have never once in 5 years submitted written notification to the HOA for a propane delivery. Nobody does that. Where does it even say that specifically?" "Section 7, Paragraph 4, she repeated like that meant anything specific. "Can I see that?" Phil asked politely. "I don't carry the full covenants document with me," Debra said. "You have a clipboard," I pointed out. "It doesn't have that document on it." "Then what's on it?" "My notes," she said. I took a breath. "Debra, there is a major storm coming in less than 20 hours. I need this propane delivered today. I'm going to freeze without it. My tank is low." "You should have planned better," she said. "I want you to understand that it was 11 degrees outside at this moment, and she said that to me with a straight face." "I did plan better," I said, keeping my voice controlled with enormous effort. "That's why I scheduled this delivery 3 days ago before the storm, which is exactly planning ahead. You are physically blocking it. Large commercial vehicles are not permitted to. It's a delivery truck coming onto my private property," I said. "The access lane is mine." "He's not parking on the street, he's turning through it." Debra smiled. "The turning radius of that vehicle will cause it to occupy the street in a manner consistent with parking, which is a violation." Phil looked at me. I looked at Phil. Phil had the expression of a man who had seen a lot of things in his years as a propane driver, but wasn't sure he'd seen this specific variety of insane before. "I'm calling the HOA emergency line," Debra announced, pulling out her phone with the confidence of someone who believed she was winning. It's a propane delivery, I said. There's no HOA emergency line for propane deliveries. There is an emergency line, she said, dialing. And this is an emergency situation involving community standards. While Debra stood there on hold with whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the other end of the HOA's phone tree, Phil pulled me aside. "I've got 4 more deliveries after this, man," he said, keeping his voice low. "I can't wait around. I've got maybe 20 minutes before I need to move on." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Phil. Is there another access point to the tank?" I thought about it. The side access lane was the only route wide enough for the truck. The backyard had a fence. The only way in was the way she was blocking. "No," I said. "This is the only route." Phil nodded slowly. "I'm going to have to reschedule. Dispatch will call you, but with the storm coming, I don't know what my schedule looks like for the next several days. Phil, I need this fuel before tonight." "I know, brother. I'm sorry." He looked genuinely apologetic. "If she wasn't there, I'd have you done in 20 minutes. The tank's right there." He gestured toward the side of my house. "But I can't run her off the road." I looked back at Debra, who was now talking to someone on the phone, pacing on the street with her chin lifted, doing that thing she did where she repeated portions of her own sentences for emphasis. Phil climbed back into his truck, maneuvered carefully around Debra's SUV, and drove away. I stood in my driveway in 11-degree weather watching my propane delivery disappear down the street. Then I went inside and started making calls. First call was to Ridgeline's dispatch. They were genuinely sorry and added me back to the delivery queue, but the honest news was not good. The storm was arriving Friday morning, and their schedule was completely packed with emergency calls from customers who hadn't ordered ahead. The dispatcher told me that realistically, if they could fit me in at all before the storm hit, it would be late Friday morning at the earliest, and that was only if the roads were still passable. If the roads deteriorated before then, they couldn't guarantee anything until the storm was over and the roads were clear. I thanked her and hung up. My tank was at 30%. In normal winter temperatures that might last me 10 days or so, depending on usage. But they were forecasting -8 degrees with sustained winds. In those conditions, a propane furnace runs almost constantly. My 30% could stretch maybe 4 or 5 days if I was extremely conservative. If the cold snap was as bad as predicted and the storm lasted longer, that 30% could become a serious problem. I went to my computer and pulled up the Maplewood Estates Community Covenants, the full document, which I downloaded and bookmarked after my mailbox incident 3 years ago, because I'd learned early on that you needed to actually read these things. I searched for Section 7. I found paragraph 4. I read it 3 times. What it actually said was that heavy commercial vehicles were not permitted to park on neighborhood streets for more than 30 minutes for purposes unrelated to active service or delivery. Active service or delivery was explicitly listed as an exception. The 48-hour notice requirement Debra had cited applied specifically to construction equipment and dumpsters. Propane delivery trucks were not mentioned anywhere in Section 7 or in any other section. Debra had made it up, or at minimum, she had creatively misread a provision about construction equipment and applied it to a routine utility delivery. Either way, she had no legitimate authority to block that truck. I wrote all of this down. I noted the specific language of Section 7, paragraph 4. I noted the date and time of the blockage. I noted Phil's name and employer. I went outside with my phone, and just to start building my record, I took photographs of the street showing where Debra's SUV had been parked and the general layout of my access lane and driveway. Then I did something I'd started doing about a year earlier, after a package theft incident that had nothing to do with the HOA but which had made me realize I needed better documentation. I pulled up my security camera system. I have 4 cameras. One covers the front of the house and the driveway entry. One covers the backyard. One covers the side access lane, specifically because of the propane tank and the equipment back there. and one covers the street-facing side of my property. I opened the footage from camera 1 and camera 4 and reviewed what I had. Camera 1 had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire street interaction. You could see Phil's truck arriving. You could see Debra's SUV pulling out and positioning diagonally across the road. You could see Debra standing there with her clipboard, arms crossed. You could see the whole confrontation. The audio wasn't perfect because the camera was mounted under my eave and we were all standing in the street, but you could catch portions of it if you listened carefully, and the visual evidence of what had happened was completely clear. I saved that footage to 3 separate places: external hard drive, cloud backup, and I emailed it to myself as a time-stamped record. That night, the storm began. It started around 10 p.m., which was earlier than the forecast had suggested, and it started mean. Not a gentle beginning where it flurries for a while, and you watch it accumulate slowly. It came in with wind first, that howling kind of wind that makes the windows flex slightly in their frames and sends any loose object in the yard skittering across the frozen ground. Then the snow arrived behind the wind, and it was heavy and fast, big chunks rather than delicate flakes, driven sideways by the gusting. By midnight there was already 8 inches on the ground, and it wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. My furnace was running almost constantly. I could hear it cycling on every few minutes. I turned the thermostat down to 64, which is lower than I'd normally keep it, to try to conserve fuel. I put on an extra sweatshirt and got a blanket for the couch. I checked my tank gauge every few hours. By Friday morning, with the storm still going strong and the temperature having dropped to -5 overnight, I was down to 22%. Ridgeline called me at 8 in the morning. "Mr. Turner, we're trying to work through our emergency delivery schedule. The roads in your area are currently at hazardous condition status. Our drivers are doing their best, but we have delays. I can't give you a specific window yet." "What's the earliest?" I asked. "If the roads improve, possibly late afternoon, but I can't promise that." I thanked her and hung up. I looked outside. The road in front of my house was completely buried. You could barely tell where the road ended and the lawns began. Snow was still falling, not as heavily as overnight, but steadily. The wind had calmed down somewhat, which was actually the one positive development. No plow had come through yet. My neighbor Carl texted me around 9 in the morning. "You doing okay over there? This is brutal." I told him about the propane situation. He was immediately angry on my behalf. Carl had known about the Debra incident because he'd actually seen part of it from his driveway when he'd come home Thursday afternoon, and he'd texted me at the time asking what was going on. "That woman is unbelievable," he replied. "You want to come over here? I have gas heat. I can put you up." I thanked him but told him I wasn't ready to abandon my house yet. I still had enough to get through the day if I was careful, and I was hoping Ridgeline would make it by late afternoon. Around 11 in the morning, I had just made myself some coffee and was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, monitoring the storm updates and occasionally glancing at my propane gauge, when I heard a knock at my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone in the middle of a blizzard, so I was already a little puzzled as I walked to the door. I looked through the peephole. It was Debra Crane. I want to pause here for a moment and just let that sit. Debra Crane, the woman who had physically blocked my propane delivery the day before and left me short on fuel heading into a major blizzard, was standing on my front porch in the middle of that blizzard, knocking on my door. I opened it. She was bundled up in her big down coat, a wool hat pulled down over her ears, and she had the slightly pinched look of someone who was cold but was trying not to let it show. Behind her, the world was white and windswept and miserable. "Doug," she said, with a tone that somehow managed to be both apologetic and entitled at the same time, a truly impressive vocal achievement. "I'm having a bit of a situation." "Okay," I said. "My furnace isn't working properly," she said. "I think it might be a mechanical issue. The repair company can't get out in this storm, obviously, and it's getting quite cold in my house. I was wondering if perhaps I could sit in your living room for a few hours, just to warm up." I stared at her. I genuinely could not find words for about 4 full seconds. "Debra," I said slowly, "you blocked my propane delivery yesterday." "Well, I was following the community covenants. My furnace is running on a tank that's at 22% because you blocked the delivery truck," I said. "I'm sitting in here in a sweatshirt at 64 degrees trying to conserve fuel. And you want me to let you in to warm up?" She opened her mouth, closed it. Did that thing people do when they know they've stepped in it but their pride won't let them fully acknowledge it. "I understand there may be some frustration regarding yesterday's situation," she said, and I want you to know she actually used those words. Some frustration regarding yesterday's situation, like blocking my propane delivery in the face of an incoming blizzard, was a difference of opinion about paint colors. "Maybe some frustration," I repeated, "but this is a safety situation, Doug. It's very cold out there." "Yes," I said, "I'm aware that it's cold. I'm saving propane because of you." She had the good grace to look slightly uncomfortable, although I suspected the discomfort was primarily physical rather than moral. "Now here's the thing. I'm not actually a cruel person. I wasn't going to let a woman stand out in a blizzard, but I was also not going to simply open my door and pretend that the previous 24 hours hadn't happened, so I made her a deal. Here's what I'm going to do," I said. "You can come in. But you're going to sit at my kitchen table while I call your HOA board and explain exactly why my propane situation is the way it is. And then you're going to write a formal retraction of whatever you filed with the HOA about yesterday's incident, because I know you filed something, and you're going to make sure that delivery trucks are never blocked by you or anyone else on this board again." She blinked. "That seems like an overreaction." "That's the offer," I said. "You can also call Carl, 3 houses down, who I know has gas heat and would probably let you in without conditions because he's a nicer person than I am." She looked down the street in the direction of Carl's house, which was completely invisible through the blowing snow. Then she looked back at me. "Fine," she said. I let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, still in her coat, while I made the call. I had the number for the HOA board president, a reasonable enough guy named George Atkins who I'd had decent interactions with in the past. George picked up on the third ring, which surprised me given the storm, but he'd apparently been fielding calls from several homeowners about various storm-related issues. I explained, calmly and thoroughly, what had happened the day before. I explained that Debra had cited Section 7, Paragraph 4 as her authority to block the delivery, and I explained exactly what that section actually said, reading it verbatim from the document on my laptop. I explained that my tank was now critically low because of the blockage, that I was actively trying to conserve heat in my own home during a dangerous storm, and that the delivery truck I needed was unable to commit to a specific arrival time because of road conditions. George was quiet for a moment after I finished. "Debra," he said, "are you there?" Debra, sitting across my kitchen table, looked startled that I'd clearly mentioned she was present. "I'm here, George," she said. "Section 7, Paragraph 4 doesn't apply to utility delivery vehicles," George said, and his voice was flat in the way voices get flat when someone's patience has been depleted. There was a concern about commercial vehicle access. "Debra, that section was written to prevent construction companies from parking their equipment on the street for extended periods. It has nothing to do with a propane truck making a routine delivery to a private residence. I don't know how you could have read it any other way." Debra was quiet. "Doug," George said, "I am genuinely sorry about this. I'm going to contact Ridgeline directly and see what I can do to push your delivery through. I know they work with us on priority access when we have infrastructure-related situations. I'm also going to issue you a formal apology on behalf of the HOA, and I'm going to make sure the board revisits Debra's community standards decisions from the past 6 months, because this isn't the first complaint I've gotten." I thanked George. He said he'd call back within the hour and hung up. I looked at Debra. She was staring at a point on my kitchen table with the expression of someone who had been publicly corrected and was processing it through a very thick wall of pride. "I'd like some water," she said. "Sure," I said. I got her a glass of water. We sat in my kitchen for a while in a silence that was not exactly comfortable but was, I had to admit, kind of satisfying on my end. Outside, the snow kept falling. My furnace kicked on every few minutes. I checked my gauge, 21%. About 40 minutes later, George called back. "Ridgeline has a truck that can be there by 2:30, he said. "Roads are passable enough on your route. They'd already prioritized several emergency calls in your area, so it's doable. I also reached out to the county emergency services line and flagged the situation as a heating emergency, which bumped you up the priority list." I exhaled slowly. "George, thank you." "Don't thank me, this should never have happened. Debra, are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'd like you to come to an emergency board session next week. There are several items we need to discuss regarding your role as Community Standards Chair." There was a long pause. "Of course," she said, in a voice that had lost about 70% of its earlier certainty. After I hung up, I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and made one for Debra too, because despite everything, I'm not a monster, and we waited out the worst of the storm in my kitchen. She didn't try to make conversation, and I didn't push it. The snow kept falling outside. The furnace kept cycling. I kept my thermostat at 64. At 2:23, I looked out my kitchen window and saw the Ridgeline truck coming slowly down the freshly plowed street. George had apparently also made a call about getting the neighborhood plowed as part of the emergency access arrangement, because the road in front of my house was clear enough for the truck to navigate. Phil was behind the wheel again. I went outside with my coat and met him at the access lane. He climbed out and shook his head slowly when he saw me. "Man, I heard what happened yesterday," he said. "Dispatch told me the whole story when they rescheduled. That was really something." "Yeah," I said. "Thanks for coming out in this. That's what we do." He hooked up the line, filled the tank to 90% in about 20 minutes, gave me a thumbs up, and carefully maneuvered back down the access lane and out to the street. I went back inside and turned my thermostat up to 68. Debra had watched the whole delivery from my kitchen window. When I came back in, she was standing up from the table, pulling her coat tighter. "I'm going to head back home," she said. "Okay," I said. She paused at my kitchen doorway. "Doug, she stopped. Started again. I may have applied that provision in a way that was overly rigid. That was the most Debra was ever going to give me, and I knew it." "I know you did," I said. She nodded once and left through my front door into the still falling snow. I stood in my warm kitchen and listened to my furnace running, and I felt genuinely better than I had in about 24 hours. Now, I want to be honest with you. If this were just about Debra blocking a delivery truck and then getting embarrassed by a phone call, I probably would have let it go. Annoying, infuriating in the moment, but ultimately resolved. Nobody got seriously hurt. I had my propane, my house was warm, end of story. But here's the thing about Debra Crane that I hadn't fully appreciated yet, and that became clear over the following week. She didn't take correction well. Not at all. Monday morning, the storm was over, the roads were clear, and life in Maplewood Estates was slowly returning to normal. I'd shoveled my walkway and driveway on Saturday, helped the Hendersons next door with theirs because Mr. Henderson's back wasn't great in the cold, and generally tried to get back to my normal routine. Monday, I found an HOA violation notice in my mailbox. I opened it standing at the end of my driveway in my coat. It was a notice citing me for, and I quote, "failure to maintain adequate snow clearance on the shared access lane running adjacent to 412 Maplewood Drive," meaning my house, "creating a potential hazard to vehicles and personnel needing to access the shared community infrastructure." There were several problems with this notice. First, the access lane was not shared community infrastructure. It was on my property. I'd had the property lines surveyed and documented after an earlier dispute about fence placement that also involved Debra, because apparently we'd been building toward this moment for years. Second, I had cleared snow from the access lane. I'd done it Saturday morning specifically because I knew the propane tank and equipment back there might need to be accessible. Third, and most importantly, the violation notice was signed by Debra Crane in her capacity as Community Standards Chair. She'd waited out the blizzard in my kitchen, drunk my water and my coffee, and then signed a violation notice against me the first working day after the storm. I took a photo of the notice, dated and time-stamped automatically by my phone's camera. Then I went inside and I sat down and I thought carefully about what I wanted to do next. Because here was the thing. The violation notice was petty and it was wrong, and I could fight it through the HOA's internal appeals process, which I'd done before with the mailbox thing. And probably I'd win because Debra's interpretation was wrong again, same as before. But it would take a month. I'd have to attend a tedious board meeting, and Debra would just find another angle the next time she got annoyed at me. I needed a more complete resolution. I called Carl. Carl had been watching this whole situation develop and was, to put it gently, completely on my side. Carl was also a retired insurance adjuster, which meant he had an extremely organized mind, a deep comfort with documentation, and a professional skepticism toward people who cited rules they hadn't actually read. I walked down to his house, note in hand, and we sat at his kitchen table and went through everything. "Okay," Carl said, spreading out the papers I'd brought. The violation notice, my printed copy of the actual covenant text, my photos from the driveway, and my notes from the phone call with George. "What have you got on camera?" I pulled out my laptop and showed him the footage from Thursday afternoon. Phil's truck arriving, Debra's SUV blocking the road, the whole confrontation. Carl watched it twice. "Doug, this is genuinely good footage. I know. You can see her parked diagonally. That's clearly intentional obstruction. And the fact that it happened before a declared dangerous weather event," he tapped his fingers on the table. "You know what I'm going to suggest? Tell me. You need to go outside the HOA's internal process. You need to file a formal complaint with the county. There's a county housing and community standards office that oversees HOA governance. Maplewood Estates is an incorporated HOA, which means they're subject to state HOA regulation statutes. One of those statutes specifically protects homeowners from retaliatory enforcement actions." I sat up a little straighter. Retaliatory. You dispute a rule she cited incorrectly. The HOA board president publicly corrects her on a conference call she participated in. 2 days later, she issues you a violation notice for something that either didn't happen or doesn't apply to you. That's textbook retaliation. Carl pulled up something on his own laptop. "Here, look. State HOA Act, Section 31. Prohibits board members from taking enforcement action against a homeowner as a response to a homeowner's exercise of their rights under the covenant or their rights under state law, including the right to dispute board decisions." I read the text he was showing me. "I also want you to talk to a lawyer," Carl said. "Not to sue anybody necessarily, but just to get a letter on official letterhead that references the correct statute. Sometimes that's all it takes to make a situation like this resolve cleanly." I nodded. "You know anyone?" "My brother-in-law is a real estate attorney. He's done HOA work before. Let me call him." Carl's brother-in-law was named Mark, and he was the kind of attorney who responded to situations like mine with immediate enthusiasm. Not because he was a mercenary who loved billing hours, but because, as he explained to me on the phone later that afternoon, he genuinely could not stand HOA board members who abused their positions, and he'd built a specialty around holding them accountable. "This is actually a very clean case," Mark said, after I'd walked him through everything and emailed him the camera footage and the covenant text and the violation notice. The initial blockage was improper. The statutory citation was incorrect. She was present and heard the board president acknowledge the error, and then she issued a retaliatory notice. I can draft a formal response to the HOA board that cites the relevant statutes, attaches your evidence, demands rescission of the violation notice, demands a written acknowledgement that the access lane is your private property, and requests a formal review of Debra Crane's actions as Community Standards Chair. "What does something like that cost?" I asked, because I'm a practical person. "For you, because Carl is my brother-in-law and because I find this situation genuinely offensive, I'll charge a flat fee for the letter, $250. "Done," I said. By Wednesday of the following week, the letter was in the mail to the HOA board and to Debra personally. On Thursday, I got a call from George Atkins. He sounded tired. Not the regular kind of tired, but the kind of tired you get when you've spent 3 days in conversations you didn't want to have. "Doug," he said, "I have a lot to say to you, and I want to start with a genuine, personal apology. What Debra did with that delivery truck, and then the violation notice, put this entire HOA in a very uncomfortable legal position. I've spoken with our board's attorney, and she largely agrees with the analysis in your attorney's letter." "Okay," I said. "We're rescinding the violation notice today. I'm also sending you a written letter on HOA letterhead confirming that the access lane at your property is your private property and that the HOA has no jurisdiction over it for purposes of covenant enforcement." I let out a long, slow breath. "Thank you, George." "There's more," he said. "At the board's regular meeting last Tuesday, Debra was asked to step down from the Community Standards Chair position. She declined initially, so we moved to a board vote to remove her from the position. It passed 4-1. She was the one vote in her own favor. I honestly hadn't expected that to move that fast. Wow. I also want to tell you that your situation wasn't unique," George said. "Over the past few months, we've received complaints from 6 other homeowners about violation notices that Debra issued, several of which cited covenant provisions incorrectly or in ways that didn't apply to the situation. We're in the process of reviewing all of them. Any notices that were improperly issued will be rescinded and any fines collected will be refunded." I thought about all those notices, about the mailbox, about the basketball hoop, about all the times I just paid the fine and moved on because fighting it seemed like too much effort, about how many other people in the neighborhood had probably done the same thing. "George, I want to ask you something," I said. "The fines that were collected from notices she wrote in the past, not just recently but going back further, how far are you going to look?" There was a pause. The attorney suggested we look back to when she took the position, so about 3 years. "And you'll actually refund those fines if they were issued incorrectly." "We're committed to that, yes. It's the right thing to do, and honestly it's legally necessary given the statutory exposure we have right now." I nodded slowly to myself. "George, you're doing the right thing. We should have been watching more carefully," he said. "That's on the board collectively, including me." We talked for a few more minutes about the general state of things, and then I hung up. I sat back in my chair and looked around my warm kitchen. Outside, the snow from the blizzard had settled into that hardened, crusty state that late January snow gets when it hasn't melted but has been there long enough to compact. The temperature was still cold, but nothing like the depths of that storm night. My furnace was running comfortably on a very full tank. I thought I was probably done with the Debra Crane chapter of my life. I really did. And then, about a week later, something happened that I genuinely hadn't anticipated. One of the neighbors, a woman named Sandra Acaffer who lived directly across the street from Debra, called me up one evening. Sandra and I weren't close friends, but we'd always been friendly, the kind of neighbors who wave at each other and occasionally chat at the mailbox. "Doug," she said, "I've been trying to figure out the right way to tell you this, so I'm just going to tell you directly. I saw what happened with the propane truck. I was home that afternoon and I watched it from my living room window." "I appreciate that," I said. "But that's not why I'm calling," Sandra continued. "I'm calling because I was talking to a few other people on the block, and something came up that I think you should know about." She told me that she and a couple of the other neighbors had been talking about their HOA fines over the past few years, comparing notes, and they'd noticed something unusual. Some of them had received violation notices, and paid the associated fines, but later discovered that those fines had apparently not made it into the HOA's official accounts. What do you mean? I asked, sitting up in my chair. I mean, Sandra said carefully, that when I looked at the HOA's published annual account summary that they send out every February, the fine revenue listed doesn't match what I know several of us paid, and I'm not the only one who noticed. I was quiet for a moment. Sandra, how many people have you talked to about this? 5 or 6, and we're all looking at the same discrepancy. Small amounts individually, but added up. You need to talk to George Atkins, I said immediately. And you need to document everything. Save your payment receipts, your violation notices, any correspondence. And you may want to talk to an attorney. We were actually hoping you might connect us with the one you used, she said. I gave her Mark's number. What unfolded over the next 2 months was substantially more serious than I had expected when I first watched Debra plant her SUV in the middle of the road on a cold Thursday afternoon. Mark, working with Sandra and 5 other neighbors, conducted a careful review of the HOA's fine revenue records and the payment records held by the individual homeowners. The numbers didn't reconcile, not by a small margin. The total discrepancy across all the homeowners they could document and across the 3 years of Debra's tenure as Community Standards Chair was significant enough that Mark said, very quietly and professionally, that this wasn't a bookkeeping error. This was embezzlement. Fines had been collected directly by Debra in cash, in several documented instances where homeowners had paid her personally rather than submitting payment to the HOA's formal account. Several of those payments hadn't been recorded in the HOA's accounts at all. The fine revenue in the HOA accounts was lower than it should have been given the number of notices issued. And Debra, as the person who wrote the notices, was also the person who had most often been the direct collection point for fine payments in the informal process she'd apparently established. Mark filed a report with the County Housing Authority, who referred it to the county prosecutor's office given the potential criminal nature of the financial discrepancy. The prosecutor's office opened an investigation. I won't tell you that it was all resolved in a week, because it wasn't. These things take time. But about 2.5 months after that blizzard Thursday, Debra Crane was charged with 3 counts of misappropriation of HOA funds. The total documented amount was just under $8,000 over 3 years. Not a fortune, but more than enough to be a serious criminal charge. Her attorney tried to argue it was all a misunderstanding about collection procedures. The prosecutor's office had, by that point, the written HOA procedures that clearly required all fine payments to be submitted to the official HOA account, along with documented evidence that Debra had been personally collecting cash payments that didn't match those procedures. Debra entered a plea agreement about 4 months after the charges were filed. She paid back the full $8,000 with interest. She was given a suspended sentence with 2 years probation. She resigned from the HOA board, which honestly was more of a formality at that point since she'd already been removed from the standards chair position. Part of the plea agreement also included a prohibition on serving in any HOA governance position for 10 years. She sold her house in Maplewood Estates about 6 months after the plea. I'm honestly not sure where she moved. Back in the neighborhood, the HOA went through a significant reform period. George Atkins, to his credit, took the whole situation seriously rather than trying to minimize it. He brought in an outside accountant to do a full audit of the HOA finances. He restructured the fine collection process so that all payments went directly to the HOA bank account with no individual board member as an intermediary. He added a requirement that any covenant citation in a violation notice had to reference the specific covenant language exactly and be reviewed by a second board member before it could be issued. The homeowners who had paid fines that had been misappropriated got a credit applied to their HOA dues. It wasn't a huge amount for any individual, but the fact that the HOA actually went back and made it right was meaningful. Carl told me, over beers one evening in his garage, that the HOA's overall tone had changed noticeably. "People actually seem to want to be cooperative now," he said. "At the last board meeting, 3 issues came up that would normally have turned into fights, and all 3 of them got resolved in like 20 minutes. George just listens and finds a reasonable solution. It's wild." "That's what it's supposed to be," I said. "Yeah, well, apparently it needed to be broken first." He wasn't wrong. About a month after all the legal stuff was wrapped up, I got an unexpected piece of mail. It was a card, a plain white envelope with my name and address written by hand. Inside was a short note, handwritten. It said, "Doug, I know this probably means nothing to you, and I understand if you throw this away, but I want you to know that I know I handled things badly. The propane situation was wrong. I was wrong. I've had a lot of time to think about it. I hope you and your neighbors are doing well. I'm sorry." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was neat and slightly rigid in the way of someone who didn't write by hand very often. I kept the card. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because there was something in it that felt genuine, more genuine than anything Debra had managed to be during the whole time she'd been my neighbor. Maybe because believing that people are capable of eventually understanding what they did wrong is something I want to hold onto. Or maybe I just kept it as documentation, because old habits die hard. The winter that followed the next January was cold again. They always are out here. The forecast came in, and it was another significant one, not quite as severe as the one that had disrupted my life so thoroughly, but serious enough that you prepared. I called Ridgeline the week before and scheduled my delivery. Phil came out on a Tuesday, his truck rolling easily down the street with no one to stop it, filled my tank to 90%, and I made sure to tip him well. We stood in my driveway for a few minutes in the cold, talking about nothing in particular, the way you do with someone you have a bit of shared history with, even if it's not the kind of history you'd necessarily choose. "Good to have a clear road," he said, latching the delivery line back onto his truck. "Yeah," I said, "it really is." Carl came over that evening, and we watched the storm come in from my living room. The snow started around 9, thick and steady, covering the street in that quiet way that big snowstorms have, a kind of enforced peace that the neighborhood doesn't get any other way. The Hendersons' house next door had their lights on, and I could see the blue glow of a television through their front window. My furnace ran all night, comfortably and without interruption, on a full tank. I thought about how much energy I'd spent over the past year dealing with Debra's HOA games. All the documentation, the calls, the camera footage review, the attorney letters, the board meetings. Thinking about it in retrospect felt a little exhausting. But I also knew that every bit of it had been necessary. Not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood who'd been quietly paying fines they didn't legally owe, quietly accepting violations that had been cited incorrectly, quietly adjusting their lives to accommodate the demands of someone who had exploited a position of minor authority in the worst possible way. There's a version of this story where I saw the propane truck get blocked and decided it wasn't worth the fight, paid whatever fine Debra sent me, and moved on with my life. Plenty of people would have done exactly that. I'd done exactly that multiple times before, with the mailbox and the basketball hoop and all the rest of it. And each time I moved on without pushing back, Debra had taken it as confirmation that she could keep going. The blizzard changed my calculation. Not because I'd decided to become someone who looked for fights, but because when you're sitting in your own house watching your propane gauge drop in the middle of a dangerous storm, and you know exactly why it's happening, and the reason is one woman's decision to cite a covenant provision she'd completely misread in order to block a routine delivery truck, something in you shifts. You stop asking whether it's worth the fight and you start asking whether it's worth letting it continue. And the answer was no. It wasn't worth letting it continue. Not for me, and as it turned out, not for anyone in the neighborhood. The new community standards chair was a guy named Robert Park who lived at the far end of the neighborhood and had an extremely calm disposition and a background in municipal planning. He'd run on a platform of basically just following the rules as written, rather than interpreting them creatively for personal reasons, which shouldn't have been a campaign platform because it should have been the baseline, but here we were. Robert sent out a newsletter in February with a summary of the HOA's restructured procedures and a very plain-spoken note about the events of the past year. He didn't name Debra. He didn't dwell on the drama. He just said that the board had identified some governance failures, had taken steps to correct them, and was committed to making sure the HOA served its actual purpose, which was maintaining shared community spaces and ensuring the neighborhood remained a good place to live for everyone in it. It was the most boring newsletter I'd ever received from any HOA in my life, and I thought it was absolutely beautiful. The Hendersons baked me a pie that February, same as they always did, and we stood in my kitchen eating it while the last of the winter's snow was still piled up along the road. Mrs. Henderson, who was in her mid-70s and had lived in Maplewood Estates since it was first developed, patted my hand across the kitchen table and said, "You know, dear, we're glad you stayed." "I wasn't planning on leaving," I said. "Some people would have," she said. "After all of that, some people just would have sold and moved on." "I like it here," I said, and I meant it. I'd always meant it. That was the whole point. You don't fight for something you don't actually care about. The propane tank outside hummed comfortably behind its lattice screen, full and quiet, and doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The neighborhood was clean and snow-white and still. My furnace was running at the right temperature and my house was warm. Some disputes end with explosions. This one ended with a full tank of propane, a reformed HOA, and a very good pie, which honestly might be the better ending anyway. I finished my slice and helped Mrs. Henderson on with her coat and walked the two of them next door through the cold, clean air of February, and then I came back inside and turned the thermostat up just a little, because I could.